I'm Beth Carroll with Mike Gunter, Jr. He's a Cornell Distinguished Professor and Arthur Vining Davis Fellow at Rollins College. And we are here to talk about your new book. It's Climate Travels: How Ecotourism Changes Mindsets and Motivates Action. And of course, I'm interested in hearing about your book from a couple of different perspectives. First, the economic implications, but certainly, secondly, the environmental implications are huge with this. And I actually want to begin with a little context. So I know this is your third book, and all of them in some way have touched on environmental issues. What is the arc of the books, or is there any thread that binds them?
Sure. In a lot of ways, you might say this current book, this one that's just coming out, is a domestic follow-up to my last one. The last book was also about climate change. It came out with SUNY Press in 2018, and it looked at 5 core misunderstandings that surround climate change. So why is it that people don't think climate change is a problem? And it did that through the lens of high-profile international destinations, places that most people have heard about, some people have even been to. So, for example, it starts off with the Galapagos Islands, and it talks about misunderstandings surrounding the science of climate change. Then the next set of chapters dove into economic issues through the lens of the Great Barrier Reef. And a third set of chapters looked at social issues through the lens of the Amazon. A fourth set of chapters at cultural misunderstandings through the lens of the oldest park on the African continent, a park called Shishlewi-Mfolozi. And then the final set of chapters, the fifth set, looked at political misunderstandings around climate change through the lens of Antarctica. And this current book is staying with that topic of climate change, but focusing on the United States, focusing on destinations here in our own country, and it's basically divided in half. Half of it is these are the threats that are unfolding, and half of it, these are solutions that are already underway, and we need to just do more of and push at the local level to scale up to truly mitigate climate change. I would say that you're right, exactly right. There is a connection to my first book that didn't focus on climate change, that looked at species diversity and the threats to that biodiversity. The focus there was on environmental interest groups. Some groups are fairly common to us, groups like the Sierra Club, World Wildlife Fund, but then there are other groups that maybe are less common to folks like Ocean Conservancy, or I'd say a lot of people know about the Nature Conservancy, but these looked at about 8 or 9 different environmental groups and looked at the strategies that they use to try to protect biodiversity. So that first book was called Building the Next Ark.
So this current book approaches this from that angle of local, where you're saying to people, see what's around, act locally across the United States. And when we think about local, I mean, certainly we get up in the morning, we go to work, we come home, maybe on the weekend we go somewhere. And I don't think people kind of connect that idea of the environment and what they're doing on a day-to-day basis. Is that something that comes out with the book?
I think it does. I think the argument, any kind of actions that we have, no matter how careful, they have a footprint, right? And so the problem for particularly the last 50 years, what the climate scientists refer to as a great acceleration, is how that footprint has increased exponentially. And so the idea of ecotourism it's not a new idea. The idea of the power of travel is not a new idea. I mean, Mark Twain wrote about the power of travel in another century. Rick Steves is a popular travel writer. He talks and writes about the power of travel. The great thing with travel is you don't have to go far to see new things and experience new ideas. And the power of that, from Mark Twain to Rick Steves to you and me, is that we not only see these new things, maybe taste these new things, hear these new things that are inspiring to us, but we also learn more about where we come from and what we're doing well and what we need to improve upon. And so that's at the heart of the book, is this idea that there are things that we are doing well, and there are things that we are not doing well, and we can do better. And you don't have to go, particularly if you're in Florida, you don't have to go to Glacier National Park and learn about climate change. You can go to St. Augustine, or you can go to South Beach, or sometimes you can just stay right in your own neighborhood during hurricane season, and you can learn more about climate change right here in the state of Florida. So, and that's true in lots of different places across the country. And I make sure to point that out in the book, that yes, travel carries a footprint. So it's very important that we be conscious of where we travel, how we travel, and most importantly, what we do after we travel. It's those actions that we take afterwards. Can we make that travel hold political currency in the aftermath of it?
Can you give us for example, of something here in Florida where we can go, recognizing that travel itself, of course, is part of our footprint that we leave behind, but what could we do in Florida? What's reflected in the book? And in the end, what is that action?
Sure. So there's lots, I'll kind of come at that backwards. There's lots of different types of actions. The key is, how do we scale those actions up? One action in Florida that I write about, I start off the second half of the book about a trip to University of South Florida and a solar conference that I attended there. And it's one that is sponsored by a group called Solar United for Florida. It's a offshoot of a group that was started by two 14-year-olds in the DC area after they saw Al Gore's Inconvenient Truth. And there's about 13, I believe, different states across the US that have a version of this. But our version was started by two folks that heard on NPR that story about these teenagers and decided, hey, why don't I do this here in Florida? And basically what a co-op is it brings together people that are interested in solar, but a little bit anxious about the technical aspects, the cost, and together through this group, Florida Solar United, they are able to vet a provider and an installer and get a price that would be lower than they would get on their own, and cut through all that anxiety and that economic worry. And what I would argue is, we are the Sunshine State. Distributed solar, rooftop solar, these micro examples of solar, we can do a much better job in Florida of promoting that. There are other states that don't have the same kind of sunlight that we do that are doing better than us, and it's a matter of political will. This is another example of an environmental issue that has had historically and can continue to have even more so vast ideological buy-in, whether you're coming from the right or left. There's lots of reasons in terms of independence, making your own power, saving money over the long run, to be interested in this. And as we've seen in Florida, particularly the last decade, there's been some very unusual political partners from all parts of the political spectrum that have been supporting this. Now, more to your question, where can we go to see the need to make these kinds of steps? It's almost like where can you not go in the state of Florida? Alaska has the biggest coastline in the U.S., but we're next in rank. There's about over 1,300 miles of coastline in Florida. And so that story, in terms of sea level rise, in terms of the increasing damage from storm intensity just on the coast alone, is very visible. We have what they call sunny day flooding in many parts of the coast, where during high tides, a number of areas like St. Augustine struggle with the threat of ocean rise from these high tide events. And so, yeah, there are so many different places in Florida we can go to. South Florida has spent, I think the last figure I saw was now over $600 million on just a small area of South Beach in Miami area, on raising street levels and adding some pumping systems to deal with precisely that, with this sunny day flooding. Unfortunately, it's money that's only going to get us through another 17, 18 years, because by 2050, I think the projections are they'll have to start over with that. There are a lot of different places that we can go and see the impacts of climate change in Florida.
And I also wonder our actual activities and how they're impacted. I think a lot about, for example, fishing and other outdoor recreational sports that in the long run, aren't they as well being impacted by climate change?
Sure, they sure are. One of the chapters I have starts out up in Maine, in Acadia National Park, and it talks about the lobster industry. It's a very lucrative industry. It's so lucrative, it's almost a problem. There's teenagers that can make $60,000 in the summer and decide that they don't need to or want to go back to high school when fall kicks around. And what's been happening in Maine is that they've been enjoying the boon from, technically lobsters don't migrate, but habitat has been shifting towards Maine waters for several decades now. You've seen the loss of the lobster industry in the southern New England states, and Maine has gained, but that is going to continue. And the projections are that somewhere around where I retire in the late 2030s, it's going to be very hard to find an American lobster in American waters, that we'll have to rely on Canada for that. And that's just one example, but that's a very lucrative industry. It's being directly impacted by climate change.
It sounds to me that the book is bringing out a couple of things. Time, that people aren't necessarily, it always seems like something down the line, but secondarily, you're saying, go see it with your own eyes. And that will help you get at that reality.
That's a great question. I think the problem with a long-term issue like climate change is that it is the distance. It seems like it's, we've known about this for decades now. I mean, there was a study way back in 1965 that was given to the President of the United States. Since 1988, it's been on the public consciousness in terms of congressional hearings that were splashed across the front page of the New York Times. Since 1995, there's been global recognition, including here in the US, that this is a serious problem that we have to look at. This idea of anthropogenic climate change, human-caused climate change. So this is decades in the work. But the reason, particularly in the United States, that I think it hasn't really grabbed public opinion sufficiently, fancy political science where there's the salience, has been the significance of it has often fallen below other things, like Medicare or a war somewhere, whether it be Ukraine or Afghanistan or a tax proposal or healthcare issues. It's always fallen lower on that ladder of priorities for Americans. is that we see this as a problem for island states in the Pacific or Bangladesh and poor countries in those regions of the world, or at worst, a problem, like you say, temporally distant for our children or our grandchildren. And there's an economic argument that why would we spend a bunch of money to do that now when we might be able to address solutions to climate change more affordably as technology improves later. So let's just enjoy ourselves now. And the simple truth is, we've been getting this message from the expenses tied to natural disasters for many years now, is that no, climate change isn't a problem for 2050 or 2040 or 2030. It's a problem right now in 2023. It's a problem that is costing us money. And here's the kicker from a scientific standpoint. If we don't take action now, it very well will be too late to take action later. So it's not that we're saving money by waiting to take action. We're actually saving money by taking action now. It's true that there will be technological advances, but the tipping point by which it becomes too late to really make a difference in terms of climate change already taking hold. I mean, there's lag already in the system. The carbon that we've put in there is going to continue to change climate well after you and I are gone. The point is, we have to take action now to minimize that carbon that's already built in the system. We can't continue to put more in.
So there's a lot of talk to what you're saying. The expression is the cost of doing nothing, focusing on what is that in terms of dollars. But I think a lot of people also think it's a big problem. And much as I think something should be done, I'm just one person and I can't do anything.
I think there's two pieces to that. One that maybe I didn't address well enough in your last question is, this is an expensive problem, but it's also an opportunity to make a lot of money. And so I think today the discussion has been about how this is an expensive problem to address, and not enough about, well, if we don't address it, it's a very expensive problem to deal with. And if we do address it, there's lots of opportunities to make money. But back to your question, that's a very real problem in the industry about climate communication. There's a couple different ways people have articulated that concern. One is this idea about eco-anxiety, that this problem is so big, I'm just going to pretend like it doesn't exist. And that's another point to this book, is to show that there are actions that are already happening. This is not something without solutions, but it is also not meant to say that, yeah, just eating, less meat, driving less, and stopping from using plastic bottles for your water is going to solve the problem. It's not. These are actions that we have to scale up. I mean, one statistic that is a little bit surprising, I would hope, for most people, is the fact that we use something on the order of 17 million barrels of oil annually for water bottles, plastic water bottles. If you add in the amount of oil, so oil is used to produce plastic. These plastic water bottles, if you add in the amount of oil that we use for refrigerating and transporting those plastic bottles, that jumps up to something like 50 million barrels of oil. That equates to about 13% of the oil that we import annually from Saudi Arabia. So we're using 13% of our oil from Saudi Arabia to support plastic water bottles. Yes, individual actions will not be enough, but part of the problem at our national level right now is there's not the support at different local entities to push that agenda. And that is an agenda. Do you want plastic water bottles, or do you not want plastic? Is that what you want to use your oil for? Plastic water bottles. I think that what can one person do? The first thing they can do is, there's a climate scientist named Katharine Hayhoe that says is they can talk about it. Let's not make this a taboo subject like Senator Rick Scott tried to do when he was governor here in Florida. Actually tell Florida Environmental Department that they can't use the phrase global warming or climate change. This is a topic that we, like I said before, there's a lot of room for different ideological backgrounds. You just think about it from a conservative standpoint, you would want to avoid radical change. Climate change is radical. It is changing the world in which we live, and it's costing us a lot of money. So that's why you have things like the Green Tea Party coming into Florida and working with what many would consider interest groups from the left, environmental interest groups from the left, to push more options for rooftop solar and push very hard against a powerful utility lobbying bloc here in Florida. So what can one individual do? I'd say start, like Dr. Katharine Hayhoe says, start with talking about climate change and doing so in all kinds of sectors, from if you're a person of faith, from your faith, from your kids' athletic groups. Remember, though, that this isn't something where you want to be trying to drown someone in numbers, drown someone in black and white ethics. This is something where we're trying to find common ground. There's a reason I think that the national parks are so popular in the United States. It's because we agree that these are special places and we enjoy seeing them. That's the same kind of mentality that I argue exists in identifying climate change as a problem when we go and we see places where it is an immediate threat. And that's the same type of mentality, I think, that exists where we can tap into that those common interest in building solutions. We're not always going to agree. There's plenty of a room for disagreement on what the exact policies should be. That's okay. But what we have to do right now, I mean, the clock is ticking. What we have to do right now is agree that this is a problem and that we have to put in a range of solutions to address it. There's no one silver bullet, but there's gonna be a need for a range of solutions that cover the ideological spectrum.
I want to circle back to your book and give you an opportunity to let people just joining us know about the book. And I imagine everything we've been talking about comes out in some way in the book. It's called Climate Travels: How Ecotourism Changes Mindsets and Motivates Actions. Tell us the thrust of the book.
Sure. We've been talking about climate change for decades now in the United States, and the action to date at the national level and our commitment at the international level as Americans has fallen woefully short. And my argument is the best way to fix that, the sort of the political roadmap, if you will, for bringing the United States into the fold and addressing the challenge of climate change, is at the local level. And that the way that American citizenry will better recognize both the threats and the solutions to climate change is to go see it themselves, to tap into that power of travel. That's the missing link, that Americans, once they see this and better understand it, will agitate and mobilize through that local level, which tends to, because it's more emphasis on the practical, tends to historically be less politically polarizing, brings together people from all different political stripes. That will push the momentum in the direction that we need to scale up to national interest. So, join a group, look into rooftop solar, push for more walkable cities, for mass transit options, public transit options. All these economic studies show that brings, there's immediate selfish economic interests that can be tied to that, but there's also these long-term economic interest, and that's the key. So the general thrust of the book is that travel allows us to see both where the problems are and the solutions are, and scaling up from that local level is possible once we better understand those needs.
My guest today, Mike Gunter, Cornell Distinguished Professor and Arthur Vining Davis Fellow at Rollins College. The book is Climate Travels: How Ecotourism Changes Mindsets and Motivates Actions. You can learn more about the book at michaelgunterjr.com. I'm Beth Perrell.